Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you all for being here. My name is Skip Rutherford. I'm Dean of the Clinton School, and welcome to another in the great series of our public programs. This book is one that I have been anxious to read since I read about it coming out, and I'm in the middle of it, and it is absolutely fantastic. So I'm glad you're here today. I want to say before we start that you may have seen this box out in front of the school, a big box. We are collecting sleeping bags and socks for the homeless. It's an effort that our students are doing. We've now collected over 70 sleeping bags, 126 pairs of socks, and $750 for the van which distributes materials to the homeless as part of our holiday giving. So it's cold out there, and 70 sleeping bags plus. We'll be collecting the materials today and tomorrow. Additionally, at the Eben Alexander lecture, which several of you were there, we passed the hat for the Community Service Fund at First United Methodist Church. They provide transportation to the homeless, to medical facilities, to reunite with families, and to job interviews. And with your help, we raised over $2,000 for them during the month of December. So public service happens every day here, and we appreciate your help. If I could ask if you could turn your cell phones and other electronic devices off, I would appreciate it. Reading from Days of Fire. As the presiding officer of the Senate, the Vice President typically had a ceremonial office in the Capitol and played a role in pushing legislation. But Cheney took it further than any of his predecessors. He secured permission to attend the weekly luncheon of Senate Republicans, something Democrats had rejected when Lyndon Johnson tried it after becoming vice president. And Cheney became the first vice president given an office on the House side of the Capitol where he could monitor the lower chamber too. Bush made clear Cheney had his proxy. When you're talking to Dick Cheney, you're talking to me, the president told one Republican senator. When Dick Cheney's talking, it's me talking. Peter Baker is the White House correspondent for the New York Times. Prior to joining the Times in 2008, he wrote for the Washington Post, where he covered the White House during the Bill Clinton and George W. Bush presidencies. In 2000, he wrote The Breach, Inside the Impeachment and Trial of William Jefferson Clinton. His new book, which is receiving much attention and great reviews, is a history of the Bush-Cheney White House. From September 11th to the U.S. invasion of Afghanistan and Iran to Hurricane Katrina, Peter covered them all. Days of Fire discusses each, but with detail and with precision. Days of Fire highlights the very complicated, complex, and challenging relationships between President Bush and Dick Cheney, arguably, correctly, the most powerful vice president of our time. Please welcome Peter Baker.
Well, goodness, thank you very much for that very warm introduction, Skip. That's great to hear that you're actually reading through the book. I know it's long. It gets faster. Keep going. Picks up speed as you go along. I don't want to spoil the ending, though. It's a blockbuster. Thank you all for having me here. It's a great treat to be here in Little Rock. I spent a little bit of time here in the past in a different role, in a different era, and it's nice to be back and see that era memorialized in such a compelling and fascinating way across the way here. It's the Clinton presidency obviously will always be one that we study and look back on and debate and read and examine and for historians and just people interested in history, it's going to be the gift that keeps on giving for a long time. And I have great admiration for everything that the library, the museum, and the school here are doing in Little Rock, and I'm very honored to be here. So thank you for coming, and thank you for being a part of this. It actually was the Clinton administration that taught me something as a reporter covering the White House, which is that we don't get what's really happening at the time. When we cover the White House, reporters like myself and a whole bunch of us who follow them around, we're in the bus, we're in the bubble, we're in the back of the plane, we're in the briefing room asking questions. In the end, I think we're probably getting maybe 20% of what's really going on. I think we get the essential truths. I think we get the larger themes and some of the bigger cleavages and issues and debates that are going on. But so much that happens in the White House happens outside of our view, outside of our line of sight and our earshot, that only afterwards do you get a chance to really kind of go back and re-examine, think about, and talk to people and understand what really happened. That was the experience I had in writing The Breach, which was a book about the 6 months that the Congress decided and battled what to do over President Clinton's issues in terms of impeachment. As I always used to say, it's not about the sex, it was about the power. My wife always says, don't say that, nobody will buy the book. But in reporting that book and going back to all the players, having covered that story so intently, I thought I knew the story well, and I discovered how little I really understood about what was happening behind the scenes. And so I wanted to do the same thing then for the Bush and Cheney White House. And once again, having a chance to spend more time with people after the events are over, after the consequence of the daily headline has faded, and they're beginning to be more thoughtful and candid and willing to open up and share, you begin to peel back the curtain and discover all the different things that were happening that we had very little understanding of. And one of the things that we learn, I think, by going back and re-examining the Bush administration is to rethink and relearn about this extraordinary partnership between president and vice president. As Skip said, it starts off with a remarkable tandem between two political figures who have bonded themselves into a partnership unlike any previous president and vice president had ever had. Now, that may not be saying much. The history of vice presidents in this country is kind of a sorry one, right? I mean, you know, as John Adams, the first one, said, it was the most insignificant office ever created by man. Jack Gardner, who was one of FDR's 3 vice presidents, said famously it wasn't worth a bucket of warm spit or something. It really wasn't even until Walter Mondale that they even let the vice president in the White House. No vice president until Mondale even had an office in the West Wing. Mondale was the first. So Gore obviously begins to become a more influential vice president, and Cheney takes it the next step. He redefines the role in a way that no prior vice president had done. Part of the way he does that is by sublimating himself to Bush. He actually does something that previous vice presidents really don't do. He actually buries his own personal ambition in favor of the president. It's interesting, we think of Cheney being very powerful, and he was, but part of the way he did it was by deferring his own ambition. And by that I mean, he was the first vice president in modern times, really since Charles Dawes in the 1920s, who came into the White House not planning to run for president himself, right? So this completely different relationship between president and vice president when they don't have a rivalry or a sense of competitiveness. You saw that with President Clinton and Vice President Gore, much like, you know, California, where, you know, everything is sunny and bright on the surface. Underneath there are these tectonic plates that kind of grind against each other. It's kind of a natural thing between two men of ambition and drive and the desire to sit in one chair that can only fit one person at a time. Cheney didn't have that, didn't plan to run for president, and therefore Bush empowers him, gives him authority and trust that go beyond what any president had done before. As Skip read, he told people, when Dick Cheney talks, it's me speaking. And Cheney uses this access to great degree. He uses it to great effect. You know, Harry Truman only met with FDR as vice president twice. And Cheney was asked once in 2002 how many times he had met with Bush. And he pulls out his little schedule card. He said, well, let me see, 3, 4, 5, 7. 7 times, he says, today. He was in every meeting. He was in every decision that he wanted to be part of. But he wasn't the figure of mythology that we came to think of, particularly through the late night comedies and the Saturday Night Live satires. He was not, in fact, the sort of figure who was dominating the room. In fact, actually, people who were in the room tell us that the alpha male in the White House, as Dick Myers, the former chairman of the Joint Chiefs, put it, was in fact Bush. He would be the one who would be running the meetings. He would be the one who was directing the conversation, asking the questions. Cheney actually sat through most of these meetings without saying a word. Didn't actually offer his opinion unless the president asked for it. And all the aides would walk out of there kind of scratching their heads, not entirely sure where he stood. But what they noticed, of course, is when they walked out of the room, Cheney stayed behind. And that's where he had his influence with the president. It was just the two of them in a room, which is a pretty good deal if you think about it, right? If it's only you two talking in a room, nobody else knows what position you've taken. So if the president makes a decision, people can assume, well, that must be what Cheney asked him to do or suggested he do. But if in fact you've lost, nobody knows that you lost the argument because in fact it was done in private. So Cheney understands Washington. He comes into this new role with what he calls a different understanding. Dan Quayle had gone to visit him and says, well, I know you're going to be going to a lot of fundraisers and funerals. It's okay, we all do it. And she says, I'm not going to be doing that. I have a different understanding. And his understanding was that he was going to be a player on lots of different fields, but particularly in national security, where he had a great interest. So he understands power, he understands Washington, he understands how to make things work. He outmaneuvers rivals like Colin Powell and Condi Rice on issues like the climate change and interrogation and detention. And obviously on 9/11, sort of his role in running the situation, not the situation, but the bunker underneath the White House while President Bush is on Air Force One being flown from military base to military base, seems to validate in that moment, in effect, Bush's choice. There's somebody who understands national security, who coolly, calmly makes decisions without having to think twice about them. He literally conveys the order to shoot down hijacked planes, as one aide put it, in the space of time it takes a baseball batter to swing a bat at a ball, at a pitch. And it's in that moment that he really comes into his own. And from that point, he and Bush go forward in a parallel direction. Now, I think a lot of people think that means, aha, Cheney manipulated Bush into doing things that he wanted to do. That's the common mythology, right? Cheney the puppet master, Bush the puppet. But in fact, it's much more complicated and much more interesting than that sort of caricature version of events. Cheney did argue for certain policies and courses of action, but the difference is that Bush actually was inclined to go that way anyway. He was pushing on open doors. Bush was like-minded with the vice president on issues like Iraq, with issues on terrorism, and so on. So when people say, aha, he manipulated the president, what they misunderstand is, in fact, this is where Bush would have been inclined to go even without Cheney. And there are moments, even in the height of Cheney's power, where Bush says no, doesn't want to go as far as Cheney wants to go. Great example, and it comes in 2002, the summer, when Cheney and Rumsfeld come to President Bush and say, we think you ought to go ahead and bomb northern Iraq right now because there's a chemical weapons facility there. This is 8 months before the war actually starts. Bush says no, he doesn't want to do that. He wants to go to the UN. Cheney doesn't want to go to the UN. Bush says we're going to the UN anyway. So even at the height of his power, there are moments where Bush and Cheney are on opposite sides of important decisions. And that begins to change even more dramatically as time goes on. As the war takes a bad turn, as we discover that there were no weapons there, Bush begins to think about how he's going to reorient his presidency. He wants to try more diplomacy in his second term. He wants to begin compromising on some of these counterterrorism programs that were so controversial in the first term. And all of these ideas, all of these changes that Cheney sees, he finds disturbing, and he becomes the leader of the resistance inside the White House. He thinks these are a turn toward a more dangerous set of policies and giving in to the chattering class, and he fights it every step of the way. And it grows so dramatic over time, the differences as these two men diverge over time, it grows so dramatic that in the second term, they're on the opposite sides of almost every issue that's confronting the White House. They're on the opposite sides of North Korea and Iran and Syria and Lebanon and Russia. They're on the opposite sides of climate change and gay rights and gun rights and the auto bailout, on the Harriet Miers nomination, on whether to fire Don Rumsfeld. All of this leads to a final, rather dramatic confrontation over what to do about Scooter Libby, who had been the Vice President's chief of staff. Now, the evolution of this relationship, which I think we sort of understood in a general sense, but not as detailed at the time, is really exemplified by two particular moments that show how much it changes over time. The first comes in March of 2003. They're about to go to war in Iraq. Donald Rumsfeld, George Tenet come to the White House and they say, we've got this intelligence that shows where we think Saddam Hussein is. Should we have a strike right now to try to decapitate him, to take him out? It would end the war at a very early stage. And the president gathers his team around and they debate the idea, and the pros and the cons. And then he kicks everybody out, everybody except for Dick Cheney. The one person he wants to talk with in this moment where he is making such a consequential decision is his vice president. And he comes out of this meeting and he gives the order to go, and that's the beginning of the Iraq War. So flash forward 4 years. It's 2007. The Israelis have come to Washington, and they've got intelligence showing that the Syrians have a nuclear facility that they hadn't disclosed, that the North Koreans had helped them build it, and the Israelis say that they think it's part of a weapons program, and that they ask President Bush to bomb it because it's a danger to Israel and to the region. President Bush gathers his team together, much like he did right before going into Iraq. They debate the points, yes or no. This time he asks the vice president to give his point of view in front of everybody else. And Cheney does. Cheney says, I think we ought to bomb it. We've had, you've drawn red lines on proliferation, Mr. President, and they've now crossed it, and to have any meeting at all, we should follow through on this. The president says, fine. Who agrees with the vice president? And no hands go up. So here, not only has he been forced to give his opinion in front of the group, he's been forced to confront his marginalization in front of the group. No longer was he the key player who was dominating the decision making. He was the one man standing outside, looking in as President Bush decides he's going to go with diplomacy in that case. Now, all of this leads to these dramatic final weeks of the administration. It's not like there isn't anything going on, right? We've got an economic collapse. Wall Street is on the edge of a chasm. The auto industry is sinking fast. And in the midst of all of this, Vice President Cheney comes to President Bush and says that he wants a pardon for Scooter Libby. Now, Scooter Libby, of course, had been his chief of staff and national security advisor, his right-hand man, somebody he trusted and leaned on a lot. Cheney's Cheney, as people called him. He had been convicted in the CIA leak case. Now, he hadn't been convicted of the leak itself, but of perjury and obstruction of justice for not telling the truth about how he learned about Valerie Wilson's affiliation with the CIA. And Cheney thought it was a bogus prosecution. He thought it was political. He thought it was aimed at him, and that Libby had taken a bullet for the vice president. And he thought that President Bush should give him a pardon because his stain shouldn't live on the reputation of a good man for the rest of his life. President Bush was skeptical. Didn't think much of it. He'd already commuted Libby's sentence. He didn't think he should spend 2.5 years in prison, but hadn't given a full pardon. So he asked the lawyers to go back and look at it again. And the lawyers look at the case. They go through the trial transcripts. They meet with Scooter Libby at a seafood restaurant a couple blocks from the White House. And they come back to the president. They say, look, we think the jury had every reason to find what it found. And so the president says, okay, that's it. We're not going to do a pardon. And he gets together with Cheney and he tells him the news. And Cheney says to him, you're leaving a good man wounded on the field of battle. It's probably the harshest thing he'd ever said to Bush. And it was aimed at something that really went to the heart of Bush's own self-identity, his sense of being loyal to his troops. Bush is so bothered by this. Bush, who famously calls himself the decider, who never second guesses anything, finds himself dwelling on this fight that he had just had with his partner of 8 years. He goes to Camp David. It's the final weekend of his presidency. He's there with family and friends. All he wants to do is kind of celebrate the end of their 8 years together. He's exhausted. It's been an extraordinary 8 years, tumultuous. Every possible thing that could happen in those 8 years, war, terrorism, natural disaster, financial collapse, all these days of fire, to use the conceit of the title of the book. And he's ready to go. He's ready to go back to Texas. In fact, just 2 weeks earlier, he had been at the White House and he gave an award to Morgan Freeman, the actor. And in giving the award, President Bush recalls that Morgan Freeman had once played a president in the movie Deep Impact. And President Bush recalled, he says, that's the one, he says, where the comet hits the planet and destroys civilization. And then he kind of pauses and ad-libs. He says, that's about the only thing that hadn't happened in the last 8 years. He is exhausted. He is through. He has gone through everything, and he just wants to go home to Texas. But he's up at Camp David, and all he can think about is this fight over the pardon. He calls his old aide, Dan Bartlett, back in Texas. He says, "This sucks. I can't stop thinking about it." Condoleezza Rice is up there at Camp David, and she pulls him aside, takes him into another room, and says, "You need to stop this. You're letting this be a pall over your last days as president." Finally comes to Laura Bush, who chides him and says, "Listen, just make up your mind. You're ruining this for everyone." But he can't quite do it. He's just struggling with this in a way he hadn't struggled with so many different things over those 8 years. And 2 days later, Inauguration Day arrives. He hasn't given the pardon, and he's about to give up power. President-elect Obama comes to the White House, and they have their traditional coffee between incoming and outgoing presidents. And then they get in the car together, and they head off to the Capitol for the ceremony. And it's just the two of them at this point, and the Secret Service. And President Bush, the outgoing president, gives President-elect Obama, the incoming president, one piece of advice, one last piece of advice. Whatever you do, he says, set a pardon policy early and stick to it. In other words, learn how to say no to your vice president. This is what is on his mind, literally with minutes left in his presidency. He's just about to surrender power after 8 years in office, all the different things that had happened to him, and this is what is on his mind, his rift with his vice president as he's leaving office. Well, the two of them go their separate directions, right? Bush goes back to Texas. He's thrilled to be out of politics. He later tells a dinner party in Dallas, he says, "When I saw Obama's hand go up, I thought to myself, free at last, free at last." But Cheney was free at last, too. He was finally free of being somebody else's subordinate, free of being somebody else's number two, and he kind of comes out of his undisclosed location and becomes a pretty public critic of President Obama, right? He goes on the attack. He criticizes the new president for his national security policies. He accuses him of endangering the country. But what's really interesting about Cheney's public fight with Obama is it really kind of seemed like a proxy for the private battle he'd been having with Bush in their last years together. Finally liberated, he can say out loud what he hadn't said before and make a Democrat the target rather than the Republican who had given him his job, but the issue was the same. Where do you take the country in terms of national security? Because Obama, in fact, while running against Bush's first term, had inherited Bush's second term. And by that I mean, by the time Bush leaves office, he has compromised on a lot of different policies so that his successor, whether it be a Democrat or Republican, would feel okay about basically keeping the large bulk of it without having to make radical 180-degree changes. Think about it. By the time he left office, Bush had gone to Congress under pressure from the courts and other institutions like the news media. He had gone to Congress and gotten bipartisan legislation for surveillance. He'd gotten congressional buy-in on interrogation and detention rules. He had signed a 3-year withdrawal plan with the Iraqi government, one that ultimately is what Obama executes. There's no more waterboarding after 2003. Bush closes the CIA black site prisons that were so controversial. He actually begins moving more people out of Guantanamo before leaving office than Obama has in the 5 years since. Now, Obama's left with the hardest cases. That's part of what's going on. But Bush wants to move in the same direction toward a more bipartisan consensus approach to his counterterrorism program. So that by the time he leaves and Obama comes in, Obama makes further modifications, he makes some changes, but largely keeps a lot of what he inherits. We see that in the headlines in the last few weeks, right? All these stories about the NSA program that Obama is presiding over have their roots in the Bush era. And the drone war that we've seen in Pakistan began in the last year of Bush's tenure. So what Cheney is railing about with Obama is what had privately frustrated him so much with Bush in the final years of their partnership together. Now, what's the status of these two men today? Where do they stand? I think their relationship today is proper, respectful, but they don't talk very much. They're not friends. I asked Vice President Cheney during one of our interviews for the book, he says, we weren't buddies. They didn't hang out at Camp David together. They didn't exchange birthday gifts. They didn't go hunting together. You can insert your joke here. I'm not going to. And so they don't talk very much. They last saw each other in April when President Bush opened his version of a presidential library, and all of the veterans of their administration gathered there. And Dick Cheney was there. He was in much better shape than he had been before his heart transplant. Physically, he is a whole new man today. I went to a bar where a lot of Bush White House veterans were celebrating the night before the library opening, and Cheney showed up, and he was there, sitting there in the parking lot, palling around with everybody till almost midnight. He was doing so well physically. At the ceremony, though, he's in the audience. He's with the kids and the cabinet secretaries. He's not on stage like Condoleezza Rice. President Bush says very nice things about him from stage. He pays due to his vice president. But when you go into the library afterwards, what you see is the way President Bush wants his presidency to be remembered, as most presidential museums are. There are exhibits on Iraq, of course, and on the Freedom Agenda, as he called it, on PEPFAR, his AIDS program. There's a portrait of the First Lady. There's pictures of the daughters. There are videos narrated by Condoleezza Rice and Josh Bolton and Andy Card. There's even a statue of the dogs. But what you don't see in that library is Dick Cheney. He's not there, except in passing reference in a few news clips that are shown. There's not an exhibit, as there is here in the Clinton Library, that says the vice president at work. And that's, I think, a telling coda to this 8-year partnership and how almost Shakespearean it was, and how much it changed and evolved over time, much more, I think, than we understood, and tells you about where things are today. So I think with that, maybe I'll wrap up, and we can do some questions. Yeah, we can we can have a conversation and see what you want to talk about, either Bush and Cheney, or Clinton and Gore, or Obama and Biden.
I'm sure glad we put the work of the vice president up in the Clinton Library.
Yeah.
Good move, Stephanie. Good move, Debbie. All right, questions. Let's ask Peter questions. There's got to be a lot of interest in Bush and Cheney, and this is Craig. Wait for the microphone, buddy. Wait for the microphone, buddy.
I really don't need it.
I know.
That's overkill.
I know it, but anybody that wears those shoes needs it.
Yeah, I have to keep going. I'm fascinated by the relationship now between Biden and Obama. Mm-hmm. Is Biden a cheerleader? Mm-hmm. Is he a confidant? Is he all of the above? Does he get down in the trenches and do the dirty work that Obama really never experienced as a 2-year senator?
Right.
I'm just fascinated by that and how that's playing out.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that Cheney changed the job in a way that every successor will find it different than every predecessor. In other words, I think that there's more of an understanding coming in that a vice president is going to be a more meaningful partner than they had been in the past. But it's interesting, I asked Biden about this right before he took the oath in 2009, and it has to be the first time in history that a vice president came in vowing to be less influential than his predecessor. I'm not going to be Cheney. But in fact, he was, he certainly was influential, particularly in the early days. The dynamic wasn't that different in the sense you had a guy at the top who was younger and less experienced at Washington, and the number two who had decades of Washington experience and was seen as more of a gray hair in that sense. But I don't think that Obama ever quite took Biden as seriously as Bush took Cheney. I think he gave him some very important roles. In the first term, he was in charge of the Iraq withdrawal, and he was in charge of the stimulus program. Those are huge jobs, not secondary jobs that vice presidents used to get. But here in the second term, I think you haven't really seen as much of Biden, right? He was given the gun control debate, and in his defense, it would have been hard for anybody to get that through, but he didn't get that through. He was nowhere to be found during the most recent government shutdown because Harry Reid said he wanted nothing to do with Biden. He didn't want to be part of it. The Democrats were mad at Biden for some of the previous deals he had been involved with. He hasn't been involved in a public way in the healthcare conversation in the last few weeks. He wasn't involved in a public way in the Syria debate or this Iran deal. So he's taken kind of a quieter position in this fifth year of the presidency, and I don't know if that's because Obama feels himself, like Bush did in some ways, more confident in his own judgment, less reliant on your number two. It may be that in this case, the number two is running for president and wants to avoid some of the sticky issues that might give him problems. So it's an interesting question, but I think their partnership seems to be evolving over time too.
Back to the back, Steve. Wait, we'll get the microphone back at the back for you.
I love that we know everybody by our first names. That's great. That's great.
Can you?
Oh, there we go. Hello, how are you?
That's Bruce Lindsay watching from afar up there.
I have to say, when I was covering the Clinton White House, I always felt that Bruce was looking over my shoulder, too.
Can you tell us generally why you think Cheney's influence waned and he and President Bush diverged?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I think part of it is that I think ultimately President Bush begins to feel more confident in his own skill and his own judgment, his own, his feet planted in a way that you can only be planted after some time in office. I mean, the presidency is the worst on-the-job training ever, and yet there's no way to get to learn to be president except by doing it. And they all tend to get better over time. I would say even President Clinton probably felt a lot more comfortable in office after 2 or 3 years. He had, by that point, just like President Bush, had dealt with more world leaders, dealt with more crises, experienced more of the hurly-burly of Washington, and didn't need quite as much guidance or advice or counsel as he might have needed at the beginning. I think there's also, there were sort of some discrete moments that began kind of pushing them apart a little bit. Friction began to develop. I think in March 2004, President Bush was annoyed that there was this whole big fight over whether to reauthorize the NSA surveillance program that he didn't know about until the last minute. And it almost causes what he called another Saturday Night Massacre, which the entire Justice Department leadership would have resigned in protest, and he had to head it off, and he was mad, I think, that nobody had told him about it. I think he and Cheney at Katrina diverged a little bit. He asked Cheney to head up a task force to handle the recovery down in the Gulf region, and Cheney said no. He thought it would be a paper exercise. He wouldn't have any real power, didn't want to have anything to do with it, and I think that, creates additional friction. I think even the shooting incident, we laughed about the hunting. I think there's a little friction about that. Laura Bush is mad that the vice president hasn't disclosed this to the public faster and in a more fulsome way. In fact, she's in Europe when this happens, and she hears about it from her Secret Service detail, because these Secret Service details, they always are talking with each other, and they know what's going on. And she tells her staff to call back to the White House and make sure they're putting this out to the public, which they hadn't done at this point. And her chief of staff calls back to the White House press secretary, wakes him up at 6 in the morning back in Washington. He didn't know what she's talking about. He had heard there was an incident, but he didn't know that the vice president was the guy who would pull the trigger. So I think little things like that begin to create additional friction. And then I think the larger forces that are driving it apart is Bush's desire to right the ship, in effect, in the second term as the Iraq War goes badly. I think he's looking for ways to reorient his presidency, and Cheney sees this fixed point in the distance. His North Star is protecting the country as he sees it, and all these changes that Bush is making, more toward diplomacy and more toward compromise on some of these programs, to him is a betrayal of where they were together.
I'm right here. Microphone's coming in.
I'm Jean Ann Moles from Saline County. Okay, since I don't know very many people here. It worried me the entire 8 years knowing Cheney's health issues, that his thumb was so close to the buttons. What do you think his health played? Blood flow to the brain and all that sort of stuff. Always worried.
That's a great question. Obviously he had 4 heart attacks by the time he comes into office. He has a new book out himself talking about his health journey. It's an interesting question. There are friends of his who wonder whether the health issues over the years changed him in some way. I don't know whether that affected him, in an intellectual way. Certainly physically, he was at times quite weak, especially at the end. He had a hard time in the last couple of years even walking up the steps to the second floor of the vice president's mansion, and he was sort of a spent force, both politically as well as physically. On 9/11 itself, actually, while he's in the bunker, sort of managing the crisis, his doctors had taken a blood test that morning, and it showed an elevated level of something, or I've forgotten what it is, but that made them think he was at risk of having a heart attack on that day. And they didn't know what to do about it, so they have to wait till the end of the day, and Cheney gets on the helicopter, leaves the South Lawn to go to Camp David, so he's in an undisclosed location separate from the president, right, in case of a strike. And on the helicopter, they hand him a note saying, "We need to test your blood again, sir, because we think you're at risk of a heart attack." And he brushed them off, said, "Guys, we're gonna have to do that some other time." It turns out the test was wrong. They did it again the next day, and the levels were not in the dangerous zone that they thought they were. But there are all these issues that come up. You know, one of the things he disclosed in the book, which is fascinating, is that they had the pacemaker they installed inside of him was they turned off the Wi-Fi element to it because they were worried that terrorists might be able to turn it off. Right? Isn't that amazing? And that, by the way, that's apparently a plot line in this television show, right, Homeland, that comes along. That I guess I never saw it, but apparently the vice president is in fact killed by terrorists. And Lynn Cheney was watching this, and she's just blown away that this turns out to be a storyline on TV, having gone through this themselves. They thought it was rather far-fetched. And she calls up the doctor the next day. You're not going to believe it was on television last night. So I think his health was more of an issue in the latter years, at least in a physical way. It made him less energetic and less able to shape and influence events.
Yes, right here. There's a question right here.
I was just wondering, you know, through all your studies of all the presidencies, if you've noticed any dynamics or ramifications of dynamics between the first and second ladies.
Oh, interesting. First and second ladies. That's a good question. I don't have a good answer for you on that. I think sometimes they're friendly, and then sometimes there's a lot of tension there. You know, think about it. If you're the vice president's spouse, you literally are the only one of the four who has no title. What are you, second lady? I mean, you know, from time to time they do that. What is it? It's SLOTUS, right? But nobody actually wants to use SLOTUS. Not a great title, right? First Lady of the United States is FLOT, FLOTUS, right? SLOTUS, not so much. So anyway, I think being the vice president's spouse has to be one of the worst jobs in Washington because you're not expected to have a great role, but you're frustrated. You could be something, but you might. It's a lot like being vice president, I suppose. But I haven't done a real study of that. I think in the case of Cheney and his family, he relied a lot on Lynn Cheney. They're very, very close. One friend of his put it to me. He says, "Look, Cheney has 3 people he trusts in the world, and all of their last names are Cheney, meaning Lynn, Liz, and Mary. It's a very tight-knit family. They didn't even talk sometimes when the Navy stewards came in to serve the breakfast or the lunch or whatever. They would wait until they left. They're very tight-knit. And that's why this crack-up we've seen recently over the Senate race in Wyoming and the issue of gay marriage has been so interesting and unusual because, in fact, they're so unlike them to air their differences in public like that. So I think Lynn was very influential, very important. Arguably, Dick Cheney was a liberal in that pair. She's very strong, very conservative, firmed him up if he ever was wavering on some of these things. And so I think it just depends on the individuals involved. But I haven't done enough of a study to find a pattern across different administrations.
We have questions for right here. Wait till the microphone's coming at you, please. There it comes right there.
Hello, I enjoyed your talk, and I've recently read a book by Valerie Plame. Did Cheney, in your investigation, did he ever come close to being the one that blew her cover? And was that why he was so interested in the Libby pardon?
Well, I think he was interested in, I think what they were interested in was not so much the idea of blowing a cover in the sense that I don't think they looked at it as, aha, this will be a punishment. We will punish them by blowing her cover. I think what they wanted was to undercut Joe Wilson's credibility. And Joe Wilson, of course, had been the ambassador. He had been sent to Niger to look into allegations of whether there had been yellow cake uranium sold to Iraq, and he came back and said basically no, he didn't think there had been. And he concluded that the vice president's office had ignored this evidence prior to the war, and he wrote about it in the New York Times. And what Cheney was upset about was this idea that Wilson advances in the column that he had been sent at the vice president's request. Cheney didn't know anything about this. He hadn't heard of this guy. He didn't know how he had been sent to Niger. And as far as we can tell, never saw any report that he would have filed back. So what they were trying to do was to undercut him, which unfortunately maybe, but happens in Washington every day of the week, in which political actors try to undercut critics through leaks and anonymous dealings with, guys like me. And I think that what they're trying to do is undercut him by saying, he didn't go there because the vice president asked him. He went there because his wife sent him, and, it has nothing to do with us. In the process, of course, what they did was they did blow her cover, and that is, at least in some instances, against the law. There are some, it depends on certain things that are under debate even to this day as to whether she was covered by the specific category of the law that is applicable here. But I think the idea was to undercut a critic, to take his credibility away from him so that they wouldn't be under fire for basically shading or ignoring contrary intelligence leading them to war.
Your comments today have surprised me somewhat in how independent President Bush was from Cheney and other advisors. Is there any backstory about whether or not any advice was given or sought between first President Bush and second President Bush?
That's a great question. I think that was a very complicated relationship in which, like many fathers and sons, it's freighted with all sorts of, baggage and expectations and history there. And I think that the son really didn't want to depend on the father for advice, and the father really didn't want to make the son feel that he was intruding. So I think, yes, I think they did talk. I think they did have moments where the younger Bush asked him for advice. He asked him specifically, in fact, during the vice presidential search, he says, when somebody says no, do they really mean it? Because Vice President Cheney, future Vice President Cheney, had originally said no when he was asked. But broadly, I think they had this sort of awkward dance where they tried not to kind of get in each other's grill plate a little bit. Sometimes the younger Bush was kind of brash in the way he expressed that. He says, I don't seek advice from that father. I have a higher father that I rely on, he once said. And he had been critical in some ways of his father's presidency, saying he was going to avoid the mistakes that his father had made, which I think kind of, hurt the older Bush in some ways. He has more or less said that. So it's a great story to be explored, and the historians are going to look at it a little bit more deeply. A good friend of mine, I think Skip may know him, Mark Updegrove, who's head of the LBJ library in Austin, is actually now working on a book just about these two presidents, these two Bushes, with their cooperation. So I think he may be able to help us get more to into the bottom of that.
Peter does tell a story in the book, George, about Inauguration Day, in which President Bush 43 is in the Oval Office and calls President Bush 41, who is taking a bath in the upstairs at the White House, and gets President Bush 41 out of the bathtub to come down to the Oval Office. And they greet each other as Mr. President. And that was the first time that, you said President Bush 41's hair was still wet.
Yeah. Well, you think about it, right? There's John Adams and John Quincy Adams, but John Adams, by the time his son takes office, is so old he's not able to come to Washington for the inauguration. It's a very different dynamic, and this is a situation where the father is well enough and young enough to be a significant force in the family at that point.
And another reason to buy this book, Bruce Lindsay will like this. In the private dining room at the Oval Office, President Bush had John Quincy Adams' portrait hung.
Right.
Which is interesting. Okay, got a question right here. This is a great book. I really like. You can tell I like this book.
I'm not paying him, I promise.
Yes, could you
I may
speak?
not, should have.
Could you speak to Condoleezza Rice's relationship with both Cheney and Bush?
Yeah, that's a great question. Actually, one of the former aides in the Bush White House said I should have named the book Bush, Cheney, and Rice in the White House, because in fact she is this sort of third player in this interesting drama. She's elevated in the second term to Secretary of State and becomes, in effect, the vehicle for Bush's change and his fight, in effect, with Cheney. She becomes the one who fights with Cheney over the direction of the administration and is winning most of those battles. She couldn't do that in the first term. She was a facilitator, not a principal, if you will, by being National Security Advisor. In the second term, she's now a cabinet member. She's now the equal of Don Rumsfeld. She has a more of a peer relationship with the vice president, and she becomes a significant force in changing the direction of the administration. And she has a different kind of relationship with President Bush. She, unlike Cheney, she actually was friends with him. She did go to the mansion for dinner with the president and first lady on Sunday night. She went up to Camp David and socialized on the weekends with them. She worked out with the president. They talked sports. At one point during a dinner, private off-the-record dinner with journalists, she slipped up and referred to him briefly as my husband. which suggests a certain closeness to them. Nobody thought it was untoward, by the way. I mean, it was always described as brotherly and sisterly, but they were so close that that gave her a power in the second term that few others could match. Now, she didn't win every fight either, but she had the upper hand in a lot of them.
Someone else back on this row had a question. Tom?
In the relationship between Cheney and Bush, you've described Bush as changing a considerable amount and as Cheney almost as a constant. I wonder if that is true in the sense of Cheney. Did he not evolve also during this two-term?
Yeah, that's a great question. Let me take and extrapolate just a second. A lot of people talk about Cheney and wonder whether he had changed, right, in a broader sense, a longer term sense. And part of that, I think, is a misunderstanding on our part, in that Cheney, was perceived to be a moderate or a more middle-of-the-road figure because I think he was moderate in his temperament, because, in fact, he was a low-key individual, because he was terrific on Meet the Press in presenting his arguments in a very soft but smart way. He was not bombastic in the way, say, Newt Gingrich was, right, in his personal style. But he was every bit as conservative as Newt Gingrich. They actually had the same, more or less, voting record in Congress. They came in the same class. If you go back and look at his early days, Cheney was actually the conservative inside the Ford White House. He helps push Nelson Rockefeller off the ticket in 1976. He fights with Kissinger about détente. By the time he gets to the Bush 41 White House, he's the conservative when it comes to the collapsing Soviet Union. Doesn't trust Gorbachev. Let's not get too far out here. He's the Cold Warrior. I think, people misunderstood it. Even in Congress, one time the Washington Post described him in a story as a moderate Republican. He called his press secretary and asked him to call for a correction. When Bush chooses him to be vice president on his ticket, Cheney runs through all the different reasons he might not want to have him. He's, look, I'm an oil man, we're both from Texas, we have to deal with this kind of thing. One of the things he says is, I'm very conservative. And Bush says, yeah, Dick, we know that. No, I'm very conservative, he says. And I think that that's something that the country didn't quite get. So when he becomes this figure in Bush 43's administration, espousing these very hard policies, people were surprised. Colin Powell's theory of the case is that in the previous iterations of his career, Cheney had been surrounded by countervailing forces. So that in the Ford White House, he worked for a moderate president, and there were people like Brent Scowcroft and others who, were checks and balances in effect on his conservatism. In the Bush 41 White House, there was James Baker and Brent Scowcroft again, and Powell himself, and then, of course, the president. And that in 43's administration, he found a president who was much more like-minded, that actually was more in agreement with his point of view. And in terms of during those 8 years, I think actually he becomes he's very constant. I think he sees this one fixed goal, which is to prevent another 9/11 or worse. He sees a dark world around us. He sees a world full of peril, one in which 19 guys with box cutters, frankly, is not the worst of it. And to him, that is the overriding dynamic of their time in office. And almost anything can be justified in order to prevent that. And I interviewed him for the book. I asked him, what about these issues of torture? What about, do you have any regrets about any of these things? And he has none about any of them, because he says they led to a result where they left office without having been attacked again, and therefore they were justified.
Thank you. I've always felt, I always questioned the diversion to Iraq from Afghanistan. I guess I use the word diversion because that's what it felt like it was. He hadn't done what he said, Bush hadn't done what he said in Afghanistan, so then let's start this war in Iraq. And I don't know if there's any truth to that or not. I just would like your opinion.
No, that's a great question. I mean, look, I think that they were overconfident about what they had accomplished in Iraq. It was easy to push off the Taliban and get them out of Kabul and depose them as a government. And they began to turn their attention very quickly to Iraq. In fact, during the Battle of Tora Bora, which is where we last saw bin Laden until they finally got him in Abbottabad a couple years ago, Bush and his team are busy talking about Iraq as much as they are about Afghanistan. And when people like Hank Crumpton and James Mattis, the general from the Marines, were urging them to do more to try to get after bin Laden there in the mountains of Tora Bora, so they lost that opportunity. I don't think they looked at it as a diversion per se. I think to them it was a natural progression. It was the next step. And today we have the benefit of hindsight to say, well, right. At the time, I think to understand the decision, not to explain or not to defend or attack it, but to understand the decision, you have to understand the atmosphere in which they were operating. And the atmosphere in which they're operating, I was alluding to this earlier, is not just 9/11. One friend of Bush says, look, to understand Iraq, you have to understand the Anthrax attacks. And by that he means it's that there's all sorts of different dangers out there, and they're so new world and so hard to understand and to predict that they can even come in your mailbox. And at the time, we didn't know that was a domestic thing. We thought that was very possibly foreign. And there were so many other incidents that fall that they were dealing with in the White House day after day. One day they were told that there had been a botulinum exposure in the White House, and that they, the president and the vice president, had been exposed. Turns out not to be true, but they were told, and they were scared for a little while. They were told about these Pakistani nuclear scientists who'd been meeting with bin Laden. Every day, the threat report that they were getting was filled with all these different ways that bad guys are trying to kill Americans. And you, Mr. President, and you, Mr. Vice President, are responsible for stopping it. You can't let this happen again on a worse scale. Now, the intelligence agencies, of course, which had failed to connect the dots before 9/11, were throwing everything they had at the White House. Some of it rooted in reality, a lot of it fanciful. But imagine what that does to your mentality as you wake up every day and see this report showing all these different ways that there are dangers out there. And so they wanted to go out and proactively stop what they saw as the different dangers around the world, to go out and to destroy monsters, to use John Quincy Adams' famous phrase. And the biggest monster they saw, the monster who had always been on their radar screen, was Saddam Hussein. One guy who was very deeply involved with this stuff told me for the book, he won't unfortunately let himself be named, he says, look, I tell people today that the reason we went into Iraq is because we needed somebody's ass to kick. And Afghanistan was too easy. And by that he means there was this atmosphere of uncertainty and this thirst for action, both in the White House and in the country broadly, that led them to take actions that today might look differently in the light of day.
Yes, sir. Question at the back, Wilmers.
Hello, my name is Ramirez Biddles, Clinton School student, class 9, and I'd like to thank you for being here. When President Bush came into the White House, he campaigned about compassionate conservatism. And you kind of see that manifest itself through his expansion in AmeriCorps, and he participated, and I was fortunate to be a part of a program that actually saw him participate with Habitat for Humanity in Dallas. And that kind of went away as the Iraq and Afghanistan war persisted. Now that he's out of office, do you see or will the president be more interested in wanting to go back to his roots as trying to improve society through compassionate conservatism?
Yeah, that's a great question, and thank you for it. I think you're right. I think that the presidency he imagined having is not the presidency he ended up having, right? He came in after President Clinton's term in a time of peace and prosperity in the country, a time when we were focused inward and looking at ways of improving society, and he had these ideas, some of which he managed to implement, some of which he couldn't. And he wants to be a different kind of Republican. Much as President Clinton kind of tried to reorient the Democratic Party, President Bush was hoping to reorient the Republican Party away from Gingrich-style republicanism toward this idea of compassionate conservatism. Now, President Clinton once called this a great slogan because it didn't mean very much, but there were elements to it that I think today we look back on with some interest. I mean, he expanded the federal role in education through No Child Left Behind. The Republicans in Congress up to that point had been trying to abolish the Department of Education. He expanded Medicare to cover pharmaceutical drugs, does it in a more market-oriented way than Democrats wanted to do it, but a goal that Democrats shared. He wanted to have an immigration deal to deal with the illegal immigrants here. Doesn't get there because of Iraq. PEPFAR, his AIDS program, is something that Democrats and Republicans alike, I think, admire today. So I think you're right. I think the presidency he wanted to have becomes subsumed by the presidency that takes off after 9/11, both because of the events that happened outside of his control and the decisions that he made in terms of Iraq. And now that he's done, I think you're right. I think he's focusing a little bit more on that. He's in Africa today, having gone to Mandela's funeral, but it's his 4th time in Africa since leaving office. He's got a new program there fighting cervical cancer. He through his Public Policy Institute, he has a number of other programs involving education, women's rights in Afghanistan, things like that, things that are less controversial than some of his terrorism and Iraq policies, obviously. And so I think he is, to some extent, getting back to some of those roots. But I think Karen Hughes told me, she said that, one of the biggest, tragedies of the Bush presidency was getting away from this idea of compassionate conservatism, because she thought that was a laudable goal that they could have done more with. You mentioned AmeriCorps, which is a great one, by the way, because the one thing President Clinton asks President Bush, President-elect Bush, when they have a transition, he says the one thing he asks him is to keep and preserve AmeriCorps, which Bush does, and then Bush adds the USA Freedom Corps in his own model. So I think that's why this presidency is so interesting, because it wasn't what I think it was originally intended to be.
That is interesting, because Bush 41 asked Clinton to keep his points of light, and when they leave the presidency, the two things that they transmitted to one another were public service. With that, let's thank Peter Baker for being here.